Welcome, a warm welcome to the side event on the technical meeting for the implementation of national adaptation plans. The LDC Expert Group is mandated to consider the implementation of NAPs, and this technical meeting is an avenue for us to solicit inputs from wider stakeholders. We are happy to have you here with us, and we are looking forward to having a fruitful discussion on this item. So, without further ado, I will now hand over to my colleague Amina, who will be the moderator for this event. Amina, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And maybe first of all, I would like to invite you to come further up to the front, because this is not going to be a classical side event. As you can see, the podium is not very full, so we want to dedicate most of today's 90 minutes or the remaining time that we have to discuss with you, and not hear many presentations, but really to use this time to talk to each other. So I invite the people sitting in the back to come further up front so we can all see you and get into a discussion mode. So as the chair has already pointed out, we're going to be talking about the implementation of national adaptation plans. And for this, we will present some of the key results of a recent meeting of the NAP Technical Working Group convened by the LEG that took place on the 31st of May 2022. And we would like to focus today's session on the solution to successful implementation of NAPs rather than the challenges. We're excited to hear from you on what you say about the key findings that we identified during our session. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide. So, yes, the last NAP Technical Working Group, thank you, focused on two main topics. First, the experiences in implementing adaptation projects, programs, and policies under the financial mechanism, and ideas for how NAP implementation could be supported. And the other topic was potential solutions to major challenges that LDCs face in the implementation of adaptation projects and activities. Next slide, please. We had a vast representation of UN and other agencies participating in this meeting, which led to a very rich discussion. Next. But before diving into the outcomes of the meeting, let us first reflect on why countries formulate NAPs. Is it to be counted as having submitted one, or is it just to use up the GCF readiness money made available for the formulation of NAPs? It's neither one of those reasons. It is to achieve the objectives of the NAPs, which are, first of all, the reduction of vulnerabilities, but then also the mainstreaming of climate change, and to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. And the same thing goes for project proposals. Is it simply to get the money, or to achieve the results and the outcomes? It is to realize the results and the outcomes of the adaptation efforts. And therefore, we want to discuss this here. Next slide, please. So the main ideas of the meeting can be summarized on 6 bullet points, which I will briefly present to you, but then later on we will go back to these and discuss this further. And we would like to hear your ideas on this. So first of all, NAPs are developed as national programs, and they capture priority activities for adaptation for the country. A NAP should cover all aspects of building capacity, enabling adaptation, concrete interventions, and ways to measure progress, as well as links to national reporting. Second, the implementation of adaptation is a process with elements and steps just like the formulation of a NAP. Third, NAPs will be funded and are already funded from multiple sources. So the most well-known are the convention funds, such as the GCF, the LDCF, the SSCF, and the AF, but there are also various other sources of funding, including bilateral funding and domestic sources. And in order to plan for implementation of NAPs, one should map the various sources to make them the best out of the available resources. Fourth, the ultimate objective of NAPs and the process supporting it is for countries to adapt. So we need to look at how this can best guide the M&E work. Fourth, there are practical steps that are necessary to turn the implementation process into results. This includes the important task of turning adaptation priorities identified in the NAPs into projects and then accessing funding for these projects and then implementing these, etc. And then sixth, emerging priority programs. So based on the experiences of over 20 years of NAPA implementation and then 10 years of NAPS implementation, we were able to gather a vast experience, and this led into the development of priority programs. Thanks. So now this is the findings of the NAP Technical Working Group, and we would like to discuss with you each of them and hear your inputs. So maybe before starting this, I would like to invite all the current and past LEG members to just briefly stand up and identify themselves. So to also first identify who can support me in this discussion, but then to give you some recognition. So, thank you. Okay, we would like to now go into the discussion of the first bullet point and look at how the programmatic approach relates to your work and how individual projects can feed into this. And how can countries best approach implementation by taking on this approach? Does anyone want to reflect on this? And Seraphine, will you be?
Thank you. So, Rafael from UNCDF. So, as some of you know, so we have been, UNCDF hosts the local mechanism, which focuses on establishing a mechanism, a country-based mechanism that supports implementation of adaptation at the subnational level, but then using a country system. So I think, and I remember from the meeting in Nairobi that one of the discussions that we had was also somehow the inclusion of, in addition to national, to the subnational level, to be somehow taken into account, when we talk about NAP, because when we think about adaptation, most or a chunk of the actions will happen at the local level, so at the community level. So somehow, by acknowledging the fact that this vertical integration in the NAP document, but also ensuring the implementation, so that's somehow is also another aspect that should be considered, in my opinion, and from our experience, it also that somehow helps this further integration of the subnational with the national level. At the same time, there are many actions that are already happening at the subnational level that can also be somehow contribute towards achievement of the goals which are established under the NAP. So it's a double-way circuit. So I just wanted to highlight that in terms of implications, because this has implications for the implementation of the NAP. Because if we don't know how, if the NAPs somehow do not consider mechanisms or implementation mechanisms that will allow implementation of those actions at the subnational level, so it will be a bit hard then once the NAP is ready to really start up implementation and access funds. And from our experience, by having that already structured and somehow streamlined in the NAP, somehow, yeah, support countries in getting more access to finance. And yeah, so I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Timo Leiter from London School of Economics. I want to challenge the first line of the slide, which says that NAPs are developed as national programs. That's not necessarily the case. So if you look at Brazil's NAP, for example, it's very sectorally organized, and then the line ministries themselves come up in their sectoral planning with the activities which they want to do. So the NAP document doesn't necessarily itself contain the activities, projects or programs. They can, but not necessarily. So what is really important in many countries that the NAP is not a separate document, but is kind of the line ministry's development planning takes on board adaptation in their planning, because often that's where the funding is. So that's what I would recommend as approach for the NAPs. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Entry from Ghana. I think I go along the lines of Timo. I was going to raise the issue of the NAPs as they exist now actually are designed in most countries on project basis, and that are not sustainable. In fact, most of these projects are also pilot in nature, and so they are one-off projects which don't get upscaled or maybe replicated elsewhere. And so it's trying to maybe improving this NAP process. I think one of the things that we have to look at is probably looking at it as a programmatic approach, but not projectized based, because the NAPs are designed with countries actually having projects incorporated, and then you look for funding, and then you get some funds if you're lucky, then implement them, and then when those projects are ended, what next? And so I think we need to actually look at it in a programmatic approach, and that actually anchors what you said. So if the sectors are able to incorporate it into their day-to-day activities as sectors, if it is at the subnational level, if the assemblies are able to actually have it as part and parcel of their planning and programs at that local level, then it becomes a continuous process, but not a projectized something. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. Yes, I do agree that often the NAPs are still on a project base. However, what we were discussing in the NAP Technical Working Group is really that they should be programmatic, and it's not just a project by project base, but it should be as a framework. And so we would like to hear from you how, what countries can do in order to make that happen, because we would like to, first of all, use this opportunity to select hear from you to collect the good practices that we can then discuss in the next LAG meeting happening in August, and then to see how we can maybe incorporate this in our work plan. Does anyone have any? Yeah, I see someone in the back.
Yeah, so I'd like to submit that we are in the process of making the National Adaptation Plan. So, and I'm from India. I'm a delegate from India. And for a country of the size of India, making a national adaptation plan is a Herculean task. So what we have tried to do, and I came to this forum just to seek more inputs on that, is that we have constituted 7 sectoral working groups having members of line stakeholder ministries. There's a sectoral working group on water, a group on agriculture, a group on mountains, on coasts. So there are 7 sectoral working groups having around 10 to 15 stakeholder members. Now, I have read through all the 36 submissions of the national adaptation plans by the member parties in the, it's available on the website. Having read through all of them and having had the wisdom of all that exercise, what we have tried to do is make a framework to capture all that. And it is a Herculean task, but we are moving on the journey that all the groups are reporting now. What we have divided the framework is, it's very elaborate, but I'd just like to, if the chair permits, I think it's important to look at the framework itself. So what is the objective of the framework? What are the framework components? And the framework components talk about impacts and vulnerabilities for each of the sectors. So in agriculture sector, what is the impact? What are the vulnerabilities currently available? That could be mapped. Then also the adaptation for each of the sector that is happening automatically in the sectors right now. We need to capture all these sectors trying to adapt currently from their own resources and their own wisdom, including the grassroots adaptation that is happening in the community level and the sectoral level. So that is captured. And the current resources that are allocated to adaptation, because if we look at the whole ambit of adaptation, the kind of finances would never be available. So we are trying to capture what the sectors are doing currently. How are they trying to allocate resources for adaptation right now? Then we move towards, in that framework, we are moving towards expected outcomes from the working group. And that captures the, that goes towards the resourcing component. And components in detail about the guiding questions. So knowledge of the current and future impacts of vulnerabilities is important to capture in the sector. Moving on, identification of the key vulnerabilities for the sector based on the criteria. I'll not read the criteria for the convenience of time. Do the science and assessment include socioeconomic drivers of vulnerability? Are there any community level assessments included? The methodologies used in the research, which stakeholders were engaged, and then goes to the adaptation, the second portion. Current adaptation efforts, and what are the criteria for identifying them? And the third portion, then just for the brevity of time, goes towards resources required for adaptation. So current cost of adaptation, what could be the cost of future adaptation in that particular sector? I'm not going into the details, but we have a large framework capturing a lot of targets. So that is how we are moving on. That will helping us in submitting the adaptation communication first time from our country. And that process will take for more stakeholder consultation at the regional level, at the province level, and then have the national adaptation plan. So it is not looking at programs and projects. It is trying to capture the regional diversity and also the sectoral diversity into the framework. So I think that is the input at this level. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we had someone in the front who wanted to say something before we... Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Sumay Abdoum from Sudan, work for Agriculture and Forestry Ministry. Thank you. I would like to highlight what had been achieved in Sudan, some aspects from Sudan in regard to NAP's development. It has been developed since 2016, address all varieties of different sectors like agriculture, livestock, and forestry, and water sector also. Within it, many projects were submitted for agriculture, for example, by $25 million. Yet this amount of finance received is allocated only for 9 states out of 18 states for Sudan, with many localities and many vulnerable people waiting for this finance to tackle their adverse climate change conditions. In this regard, I would like to ask about these national adaptation plans were designed and implemented, and it is very it is highly important to link these plans with our national plans and strategies. And by now we have to finalize the food system transformation actions. One of them is nature-based solutions that this track has many activities in accordance to risk management plans and to enable local communities to how to be resilient to this climate condition and so on, to build their build many activities in accordance to this concern. So it is very important to build the capacity of local communities within this initiative. My second regard is how to track the progress in achieving the NAPs in regard to transparency framework. It is very important to set very clear, tailored, robust indicators so as to track the progress in accordance to the adaptation activities are more likely to be qualitative more than quantitative. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these valuable inputs. Looking at the time, I think we have to move to the second set of questions, looking at the implementation of adaptation as a process with several steps, just like the formulation of a NAP. So what could be the building blocks for implementation of adaptation and the NAPs in particular? And how can the NAP technical guidelines support this? And maybe also how can the supplements to the NAP technical guidelines support this? Have you made any experiences that you would like to share with us? This seems to be a difficult question, so maybe I invite Paul.
Thank you, Amira. And just to add to the confusion, and perhaps part of the thinking is that implementation is also a process similar to the process of formulating a plan, where you go through a number of steps to look at what you have, what capacities you need, and then to do the assessments and so forth. People in health have been developing what they're calling implementation science. There's actually a new journal for that. But it's also this thinking that implementation isn't about writing a proposal and then getting money and then voila, you implement something on the ground and it's done. It's actually quite a series of activities and processes, including how to convert priorities into programs, projects, how to integrate that into existing activities, how to build different types of capacities in ministries to create the capacity to implement and achieve results, etc. And then at some point, there's of course the aspect of writing proposals and satisfying all the requirements for each funding agency, GCF, GEF, or whatever. in the mountains of very specific requirements you need to supply. But that's a component of that whole process of implementation. So the idea was what are those major components of the implementation process that could perhaps be a basis for assessing where are the capacity building needs, where should countries be sort of enhancing their ability to effectively do this, and eventually, of course, ensuring that their sort of holistic adaptation programs are actually effective at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. I think as Paul was alluding us, implementation is really an elongated process. From, say, it is different from formulation. Implementation at different, say, process at different sectors of the economy. Different, say from finance to capacity building, everywhere. For example, how to monitor your implementation, midterm review your implementation, or say how to track adaptation. So all those key challenges at implementation phase, the countries have to face. And to overcome those bottlenecks, we need to raise our capacities, need capacity support. For example, say in Bangladesh, we have for development programs our monitoring and evaluation division under Planning Commission, Ministry of Planning. They every year try to monitor, and after 2 years or 3 years have midterm review. Then after 5 years closure of the program, they try to evaluate. But for, say, climate adaptation or adaptation programs or even mitigation programs, there is no monitoring and evaluation system as of now, because our Planning Commission, they don't have that capacity, because they are accustomed with monitoring and evaluation of development programs, not climate programs, because for evaluating, monitoring, tracking, you need climate experts. You need, say, specialized people. Not only climate experts, but also interdisciplinary people. Say, if it is a biological diversity program or water sector program, then you need to have water specialist, hydrologist, all those people. So you need to raise their capacities. And also for auditing system, our Auditor General Office, they also can't audit these programs, climate adaptation programs, because they don't have that capacity. Our Auditor General's Office, Ombudsman Office, even in our Parliament, Parliamentary Standing Committee at times constrained to deal with adaptation programs. So they too require capacity building, capacity support, because this is a new area for them. So not only it is a huge, huge challenge for formulation of national adaptation plan, but also implementation. Because at implementation phase, we do face a lot of hurdles, lot of, say, mobilization of resources, not only in financial terms, but also knowledge endowments you have to mobilize, expertise. Those are keys to have smooth implementation, better implementation, and quality programs implementation on adaptation front.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have some steps they want to share? Otherwise, we would move to the next question. I don't see any hands, so let's go to the next question. Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Amna Abdelhamid from Sudan. I want to highlight about what's the important thing, and which it seems that is gaps in many countries, that is about the climate change projection and downscaling of from the GCM, what is global circulation model to the state. It seems that because when we address these gaps in Sudan, because we have already miss of data and information about that, because when a formulation NAP in Sudan, as mentioned my colleague here in 2016, there is still these gaps. It's just in 6 stations, and Sudan is so big at that time. So this is so important things that how to continue and get the information about that, about the projection and downscaling.
Thank you. If I could follow up on that, I wonder if there are people in the room that have experience with climate data in terms of requirements for designing implementation as opposed to the assessments that happen in developing plans, which is a very different animal. But I'm assuming when you're implementing a dam or whatever, you do require and need very specific data about the future. But I wonder if there's experience in the requirements and perhaps the issues of climate rationale in the GCF projects are an example of data needs for implementation. It's not really for assessment and the planning, because that happens prior to that. But really, that's a good example of perhaps very specific, accurate data that you need to design your solutions to. But I wonder if there's a difference in then the data needs and then how can those be addressed and perhaps applied. I don't know if anybody in LDCs has actually applied climate scenarios to design a solution on the ground in specific terms. For instance, the countries that have been building infrastructure, etc., to what extent have they put in scenarios, whether it's 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, or whatever, but has there been experience with that level of information?
Well, I think the question you asked, actually, for me, a lot of countries that have done their NAPs have not even gotten the money to implement the NAPs. And so probably if you're talking within the context of adaptation in other quarters, that's fine. But within the NAPs itself, most of these NAP documents are still remaining without having concrete projects that they're implementing, unless maybe somebody in the room proves me wrong. But I do agree with the point that what informs the scenarios, ideally, and I'm using the word carefully, ideally is supposed to go into the implementation of the specific projects. Otherwise, what will be the relevance of those scenarios in the first place? I think they are there to guide what should go into the concrete projects that will be on the ground. For instance, if one is talking about maybe road infrastructure, as you did mention, and you have projected that you're going to have certain amount of rainfall within certain periods. And then it means that whatever road constructions that you are going to do should be guided by this in terms of maybe the drainage systems that are designed, and then also in terms of maybe the bitumen level that's put on the surface so that high temperatures can be accommodated in this. So I'm sure when we get the big monies, we'll be able to do that. So far, we haven't gotten that. Ghana hasn't gotten that in any way. I don't know about the other countries.
Thank you very much. As you touched upon the issue of finance, I think it's good. Sorry, Timo.
Thank you. Actually, just an hour ago, I spoke with a colleague from the Potsdam Institute on Climate Impact Research, and they have a support project on agriculture where they use climate scenarios and impact models for different crops. And then they go to countries, and the countries, tell them what measures they would like to do in this sector in their country. And then they work with local universities to program the model so they can calculate what the potential benefits will be. And before that, they validate the adjusted model with data from the past to see that the model actually fits. But he explained to me it's quite resource intensive. He said for one country, for like 5 measures, it takes 8 people full-time, 8 scientists, 1 year to develop this, but that would be like kind of the gold standard of what would be. I mean, it's very exciting that this can be done and is being done. So this is a project from the International Climate Initiative from Germany. So it is possible, but it's not yet the norm. And I'm happy to provide the link to the Secretariat for sharing.
Sorry, Paul, I just want to reflect on Timo's submission. Just quick one. I think my understanding was whether these things are actually factored in the project implementation themselves. Because the models, I think you have thousands of examples of different models that if you are not careful, they will continue to remain models on paper and also in books. And we have several examples that some of these models have been developed in different angles, from agriculture, for infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But I thought probably we were talking about how these models translate into concrete projects on the ground. Yeah.
Thanks, Andri. So what the colleague was saying is that, then you can kind of validate if the particular suggestions for the measures make sense. And if you had, the GCF would love these models, because then you could say, well, we have really calculated this on the basis of crop impact models and climate scenarios, and here we can show you that we would have a 10% benefit over something. And that is how this could help the climate rationale.
Thanks. And for further questions, please do this after the session. So maybe we move to the next part where we wanted to discuss with you, looking at funding. And as you're aware, there are several sources of funding, either under the convention or outside of the convention. But then we would like to hear from you, how can countries navigate between the different templates, for example, of each of the funds, and how can countries then also best align with the specific funding windows? For those of the countries who've already made good experiences, please share them with us.
I'm not a country in that sense here, so I just wanted to not maybe take up too much space. So this is Rohini from UNDP. I think on this question, it's clear that every donor does have their own template, and also some requirements from some of the, depending on the scale of the funding and the type of funding, there may be much deeper level of information required. But maybe since it's not moving at the scale required, maybe a couple of, I think, ideas, and I mean also coming out of some of, what we are hearing from some countries. So I think that there are some donors which are actually negotiating with the country over a 5-year period. Like they're not, funding a program project by project, but often, there are lots of donors who have, sort of a 5-year funding program for a country. So I think it's good to, to discuss programs at scale. It's probably better to discuss a group of them, and over this sort of, this is kind of sort of like a time period. I mean, the same, say, with the GCF, that the country work program is supposed to be not just one program, but a group of programs. So I think it's good to sort of, prioritize, but then really be discussing sort of like a group of programs. But I think the most important thing is to involve the finance ministry in the discussions early on, because the negotiations with the multilateral development banks, with the bilaterals, and with the other funds, I think there has to be much greater involvement of the finance ministry, because, they're actually talking to a lot of investors, and they're also the ones that are handling treasury and providing, funds to the sectors, and they get budget submissions from the sectors. So I think overall, if I were to just connect this to the previous question also, I think what would be really, helpful is to really start thinking about the audience of the guidelines for implementation of, if there are going to be guidelines. The environment ministries, can help formulate, but they cannot implement the NAP. And the implementation depends on the system of the country. So I think we can't be prescriptive about the system. In some countries, they are very centralized. So, the budget decisions get made in a very centralized way. Some countries are very decentralized, and there is funding, there's much more flexibility. So I think in either case, the ministries involved in making decisions on financial resources should be involved in the process of implementation, especially when we are discussing finance with all the donors, and also because they're leveraging their own domestic funds around this. And certainly, I think, and to discuss it for over a 5-year period or something, like not go project by project, because then things will not really move at a scale. And I'm sure all the donors have hugely different requirements, but I think a lot of LDCs do not have all that amount of data. But surely, it can't always wait for that. So, there is probably a lot that can be made of the data already. But I think my top suggestion is to involve the finance ministries, and for that really to be guidelines that in a language that they understand, so that they will basically, because they are not implementers, but they fund implementation. And they also talk to the financial, agencies, and they receive all the budget submissions from the ministries. So just a few suggestions. I know they are not necessarily best practices, but lots of countries are starting to do this now, involve the finance ministry in the discussions.
Thank you. And we also have somebody online who would like to try to connect. Let's try if the technology allows this. So I invite Sonam, a fellow LEG member from Bhutan.
Thanks, Amina. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Thank you. So actually, this is also another question. We had a recent discussion in the NAP technical working group meeting that we had a few weeks back, and we were discussing how countries would feel about a single template across all convention funds, and how that would solve a lot of issues if we could have that kind of single template. I think especially for LDCs who've had quite a bit of experience in maneuvering through the GEF funds, and now we have to start all over again with the GCF funding. I think what would be the view of some of the people who have joined in today in terms of having a single template across all convention funds to make access easier for countries? Thanks, Amina.
Thanks, Sonam.
Hi, this is Mohammed Bayoumi from UNDP, Egypt. We are starting actually a process with the Egyptian government for preparation of NAP. Actually, responding to your question about financing, I believe that the best mechanism for financing, or funding NAPs is to mainstream, the work in the national budgets. This is the starting point before we request money from donors. Because no way that we are going to be able to mobilize the resources needed in a NAP, from donors all in all. So the activities that are being done on the national level usually touch on some adaptation activities. And this is where it should be the starting point. And the donor funds come later on, to catalyze or upscale or do pilots and demonstration projects. But I wouldn't count, totally on donor funding, in implementation of NAP. And this takes me to the response to the first question that you have mentioned, related to the programmatic approach of implementation. I think for developing countries, moving to the programmatic approach and implementation would complicate things. The way we see it, in Egypt, that we are going to have a national plan, national adaptation plan. I believe that this plan has to be broken down afterwards into sectoral plans. And each ministry starts to have its plan and do the activities that they are supposed to do. Yes, these activities are within a bigger umbrella that somebody is able to see how these activities fits into the plan, and mainly from the national budgets, and this could be complemented, by donors. But if we look at it from a programmatic approach, then it would be even more difficult to mobilize resources from donors, to implement. The standalone project should be a good approach within a certain ministry or a certain sector where there is somebody who's managing the whole thing and see, how this fits together. My last point is about two issues related to the building blocks of implementation. The first one is M&E. This NAPs, should not be a solid plan. It should be dynamic plans, because technologies are changing and techniques are upgraded all the time, and this has to be reviewed and looked at. The other element of the implementation is and obviously the cost effectiveness of the different techniques. They vary with time. I cannot, have this carved in stone, and this has to be implemented in this way, while there could be other more cost-effective techniques appearing. The other element is the environmental and social impact assessments associated with this implementation of these projects, because this is extremely, extremely important that we try to fix one thing, and maybe we do harm in another thing while we think that we're doing good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see Jen. Sorry.
Sorry, thanks, and thanks for the very good discussion so far. I just wanted to reflect on Sonam's point. I think it's a very valid point when you look at the questions that were posed, and how can we, how can countries navigate the different templates. It does beg the question, how does this align with the principles of aid effectiveness that were signed in Paris a long time ago, and the commitments in the Grand Bargain, to make it more efficient and easier to access financing. So it does seem to make sense that rather than countries needing to navigate the different templates, we should also consider ways of aligning the templates and having common templates and making it more feasible for countries to be able to apply to them. And of course, linking these to the NAPs and to the documents that already exist in countries as much as possible. So I just wanted to support Sonam's point there.
Right, good evening, everyone. Jonah from Papua New Guinea delegation. Just want to share some experiences from PNG's point of view. Right now, PNG is in the process of finalizing its NEP. By August, we should be able to launch it. I think from our experience, UNDP is our implementing partner on this one, and we have learned experiences from our Adaptation Fund project from 2013 to 2017. That's where we were able to identify our priority sectors, which are transport, infrastructure, agriculture, and health. And one of the key components of the NEP that we are looking at is mainstreaming climate change adaptation into these sectors. We want to ensure that these sectors take ownership of implementing adaptation within the sectors. And I think one of the challenges is capacity. Capacity in terms of monitoring and implementing those adaptation actions within the sectors. So right now, using the technical guidelines on adaptation, we have done consultations for the last 2 years, and we are assisting our sectors to also develop the adaptation plans as per our Climate Change and Management Act, which is law, which is by law they need to develop the adaptation plans so that the sectors can be resilient. So for example, within the infrastructure sector, we're trying to look at helping our WEX and highway sector to be able to build resilient roads and bridges by developing standards that are climate resilient. But the problem now is that the government has limitations in terms of the resources. So we need to also look at how best we can access finance to be able to provide that incremental cost on top of what the government's budget has. So that is one key challenge that we have, and we would, one of our strategies that we get our sectors that are prioritized within the NEP to come into the UNFCCC process and understand what the GCF is all about, what the Adaptation Fund is all about, so that when they go back to the country, they understand what are the processes, guidelines, and then they come and network here, and then they are able to make contact with focal points here, and then be able to take ownership of the process, and then in the end, we as Climate Change and Development as a coordinating agency, we don't hold them by the hand, but they take ownership of the issue, and then they mainstream climate change adaptation within their sector so that they build the resilience. I think right now, as many of you have mentioned, climate change adaptation in these traditional sectors is quite new. So capacity to monitor, evaluate, and to budget and plan is quite a challenge for us, and that is where we would like to see the National Adaptation Plan process assist these sectors to be able to build the capacity so that they can be able to take ownership, and also, like some of my colleagues have mentioned, mainstream that into the budgets and planning processes so that we can also use our resources, and when it comes to incremental costs like climate finance, we can also help them as well in terms of how to source funding from GCF, AF, or other mandated financing mechanisms. So that just to share some experiences on what PNG is doing right at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Amélie Beauchamp from IIED. I just wanted to echo some of the comments of collaborators in the room, mostly about the idea of flipping the question around about donors aligning themselves in order to adapt to different countries' capacities, because this is thinking about principles of the Paris Agreement, but also other principles like the locally led adaptation principles, but also work that's being done on the global goal for adaptation through the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, it states very clearly that efforts on MEL and on adaptation planning need to be country-driven. As such, what can donors do to really help achieve the goals of enhancing adaptation actions? And I will also echo that monitoring, evaluation, and learning should be a very strong part of the NAPs, and that provides linkages with the GGA, with the GST through other vehicles for reporting and communications.
Thank you very much. And now you're already helping me to move on to the next question, which is focusing on M&E. So, what should guide the development and the application of M&E given the goals of the Napo adaptation in countries? Obviously, Timo wants to come in first.
Thank you. So yeah, I can't help but respond to this question. So last year I've undertaken a stock take of all the available NAP M&E systems globally, which was published as a journal article in the journal Environmental Science and Policy. And it's also mentioned in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2, where there's a sexual empirical evidence on adaptation M&E systems. And so I found that while more than 70 countries globally have a NAP, only I think 60% of them have started developing an M&E system for it. 40% have nothing, or at least there's no evidence for it, which also means that having a plan itself isn't enough. But anyway, if you have a look at the stock take, it really shows the diversity of M&E approaches for NAP. In many cases, it takes quite some time for countries to develop this because there's so many stakeholders you have to involve. But yeah, for the moment, I would just point you to the stock take article. Also, in terms of guidance, there is a supplementary material document on how to develop an M&E system for NAPs, which GIZ together with IASD, Anne Hemmel is here, co-author. and in collaboration with the LEC and the Adaptation Committee was developed in 2015. So it's a guidebook which has 4 building blocks to develop the M&E system, starting with the purpose, the context, like why do you want to monitor M&E for, what information do you need, and then how do you want to generate the information, how do you want to communicate, and very importantly, what resources do you even have and what capacities to keep the system operational over time. So that's another important reference that could guide development. Thank you.
Thanks, Timo. And I ignored Paul. He had a question to the previous topic. So please, Paul.
No, I'm taking notes, so I just wanted to clarify. It's a question to UNDP. Did I understand you correctly, UNDP, that if a country fully integrates activities within the national budgets and processes and all of that, then all of these funds can simply put money into that budget, or would that, do they still have to apply for funding through the regular proposal processes, etc., for instance, through LDCF is here, I don't know if they can comment, but I was wondering whether you're suggesting the issue of a bucket approach where if things are fully integrated into national budgets and then donors can simply put money into that because the budgeting and the planning process has already taken place. So it doesn't need to be repeated through a project development, proposal submission, etc.
Okay, that's a good question, Paul. So actually, the donors funding through the national budget, directly, if there's mainstreaming, they, as far as I know, donors do not do that except in crisis countries where there is actually a direct budget support, which is not for climate. It tends to happen for development-related, issues where there is actually funding from donors. I'm not talking about climate-related funding. There's actually funding that goes to the budget, it's called direct budget support, and it's done by the World Bank. It's done by several sorts of financing organizations. But in terms of, I think the question is around the financing of climate priorities, and I do not think that any. Of course, there's lots of people in the room with experience. I don't think there are any, donors which even if there is mainstreaming of the priorities in the sector plans, etc., they generally, I don't think, but it depends on the donor. There might be banks and multilateral banks and things like that which do actually have an arrangement like that. But I think in general, most of the climate funds that we know of wouldn't do it like that. They would earmark it towards a project, and in some cases they may use a direct access entity. But it will not be necessarily part of the government account. There might be a separate bank account for that, because normally there is a sort of like a full kind of a government control budget. So they would have a separate account for it. And if it passes through a multilateral entity, such as UNDP or others, there is something called national implementation where it does go to the government, but again to a separate account. So I think what you're saying is, does it go into the general budget of the country? And my understanding is mostly not. But the MDBs and others may be doing that. But I don't. I think I don't want to be. I think we should talk to the MDBs about that. But as far as I know, it's earmarked against projects.
Deborah Murphy from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I'm going back to this question that's up on the board. When you're saying what should guide development and application of M&E, I think we also have to have the MEL, learning, because I think it's learning that guides what happens. And I looked around the room for my colleague from Kenya. I did some work in Kenya on M&E. And the point there was, we really don't know what we're doing. Let's do it, let's learn, and we'll get better at it. And so they started looking at MEL of their National Climate Change Action Plan, and now their NAP. And sort of this recognition of, no, it's not exactly right what we've done, but we've learned. And the next time we do it, we're doing it a little bit better, and we're looking at it sort of as a process and a journey. So I think that learning is a really important part of how you go forward with M&E.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to share anything on M&E? Or looking at the time, maybe we move to the next topic. Okay. Julie, can you? Thanks. Okay, yeah, so there are several steps, as we said earlier, that are necessary to turn the implementation process into results. And so now we would like to hear from you, how can the existing efforts by the LEG and the GCF or others help the countries to achieve that, and what support is needed? And now we're not looking at financial support, but what support is needed to support the processes of implementation?
Thanks. Just to look at the second question there, what other support is needed? I think, in terms of adaptation, action, and resilience, there have been so many different approaches, and each contextually designed and appropriate. But there's also, the risk of projects that may have resulted in maladaptation or may not have achieved the results that were hoped for. And I think there's a lot to be brought in terms of technical assistance in finding the most effective ways forward when there are challenges in country. you know, I think that the events like the information sharing between countries, the opportunity to share experiences, to access the latest science, to hear from contexts that are similar about what has worked and also what some of the challenges have been. So it's one thing to have a plan, it's one thing to have financing for the plan, but it's quite a different thing then to be able to carry forward that plan that probably has quite complex different interactions between different ministries and different levels, from the local level, district levels, right up to national level. So I think in terms of quality, not quality control, but technical assistance and learning opportunities and sharing opportunities and opportunities to interact with science along the way, I think is quite an important part in this. And also learning across communities, so at the local level as well, facilitating those kind of learning and facilitating processes to kind of reflect and change course as needed if things are not progressing as planned.
Thanks. And Paul, you wanted to come in as well, or no? No, okay. Does anyone else want to share anything? This is now your opportunity to also kind of make requests how the LEC can better support you. So in case there is something. No, okay, let's move to the final question then. So as you're aware, we have had the chance to get experience from over 20 years of NAPA implementation and now already more than 10 years of NAP formulation and implementation. What are some lessons learned from those of you who have undertaken the NAPA process or also already started implementing the NAPs that you want to share with us, and how can these lessons then maybe be used to emerge into priority programs?
I could perhaps expand on the question, because I know some of these questions are difficult to understand fully. But what the LEC has been talking with the GCF and others is the idea that there are some important activities that each country is doing. For instance, there is an effort in the GCF to develop sectoral guidelines for climate information and early warning systems, because that's considered important for every country to do. And then the Secretary General has actually put in place an ambition that in 5 years everybody will have access to early warning systems. So that's something that perhaps requires a coordinated application of best practice. And WMO is leading this effort in terms of what's the best way to convert climate information into services and so forth. You get what I mean. And GCF has also prepared sectoral guidelines for a number of key sectors and systems. One is for agriculture and urban systems, I think. I don't know what the other one is. But so there's this emerging practice of key areas. And our colleagues from UNCDF about taking adaptation from the national level down to the subnational local levels through the local mechanisms. So that's another area that I can't imagine a country that wouldn't want to apply that, because that's a need that cuts across countries. So there might be other areas across the different sectors, different areas that perhaps are now emerging to be important. Mainstreaming is another. It's not you don't integrate into national planning and budgets just by wanting to do it. It's a whole process. So we wanted to hear if there's some of these things that are coming up that could be the organizing factor in terms of knowledge, etc.
Thank you for taking the microphone again. I think it is very important to, if we need to generate lesson learned from the past implementation of 20 years of NAPAs and 10 years of NAPs, we have to assess the progress in implementation of these projects or actions per sectors. Every sector has, I think, implemented these NAPs within their action plans, and we have to conduct, I think the guidelines and templates are very important to be provided or to be developed to aid the sectors on how to report on the progress they have done in accordance to the NAPs or NAVs in their sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. It doesn't really seem like anybody else wants to share something unless we have somebody online or nothing. Okay. No. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry to take the floor again, and we have not implemented NAP, but what we have learned from 20 years of implementation of NAP and what we're trying to design now, three critical things we have thought about, and I just want to share it as information, is that one, that I agree to the intervention by Egypt, UNDP. I think it's very important to understand that the scale of funds that NAP would require would be enormous. So it is very important to understand and mainstream. I know it is very difficult to mainstream, but the only option in adaptation is to mainstream into the scheme of things of various sectors and departments and the ministries. Somebody mentioned about the Ministry of Environment and Forest trying to be a nodal officer. That doesn't work, because it is important to, from the beginning, to take on important sectors for their country and frame the whole adaptation plan for that sector. The whole thing could not be funded. So I think it is important to look at NAP, the adaptation as a process to be mainstreamed into the financial windows, and the suggestion that Ministry of Finance should always be in the scheme of things is very important. So that is first. And second is what we are trying to do. We are also trying to dovetail with the national adaptation, the action plan on climate change, and the district and state level action plans on climate change. What we can look for funding is for specific model projects for various sectors and various regions, but not the whole thing. So we could look for funding only for a particular model to be developed and tested in a particular place, whether that adaptation model works for the mountains or for the plains or for the coastal areas. And then it is to be, those learnings from those models could feed into the main planning process of the sectors and the ministries concerned. So that is what we are looking forward to. We have not implemented, but we don't want to get stuck in making a great document called a National Adaptation Plan and not having the wherewithal to implement any of them. So I think from the beginning, we have, as I told earlier, we have made 7 sector groups, which has the Ministry of Finance, and every sector group is anchored in a academic institution, which is drafting that particular portion. So, for example, I'm looking at the Disaster Infrastructure Resilience Working Group. I'm chairing that, and we have a National Institute of Disaster Management. That is the anchoring institute. So that drafts whatever comes into that plan, and the Institutes of Economic Growth and Ministry of Finance are parts of all the working groups. So that is, I think, a slightly better way. And when you make the whole plan, what are the gap areas of funding, or what are the priority areas for various sectors and regions, then that could be funded by various funding opportunities, but not the whole thing. They could fund for particular small projects, and the learnings thereof could be getting back into the planning and mainstreaming process of the ministries. So that is our submission from the limited learning that we have in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that we're not supposed to put microphones in people's faces, but I wonder if you can oblige me if I'm going to ask three people also to comment on these topics. One is Anne Hamel. Second is Sarah from GEO, and third is our colleague Dorji from the LDCF. I wonder if you can also maybe comment on some of the discussions we had in terms of where you think some of these discussions could go, or whatever. But Anne, I don't know, you support a lot of countries through the NAP Global Network, and you have a wealth of experience in adaptation going back a few years. So I wonder.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Well, I think the common current, in some ways I just hesitate to say this because it feels so obvious, but maybe it is worth saying it. It is kind of a direct answer to this experience for over 20 years of NAPAs and 10 years of NAPs, is I think consistent and dedicated investment in the right institutional structures to normalize the NAP process, the adaptation planning process, and implementation, and moving to implementation. I think we're still seeing, I think earlier on, and I think it's getting better now, but it's, the NAP process sort of being driven by and undertaken in a particular corner of government and not really being socialized across government, it not being a whole of government effort. And I think, investments in those relationships, investments in committee structures, and investments in internal communications across government around adaptation is something that we're seeing more of, and I think are worthwhile investments. And sometimes we take it for granted. We think that we develop a NAPA or a NAP, and it's such a massive effort. And more times than not, you have more than a handful of sectors involved, which is great. But then those institutional structures and conversations and relationships kind of die out. And then that has huge implications for implementation, and then even bigger implications, I think, for learning. And then the next time around you want to do it, you're starting from scratch again in some ways. So I think a consistent sort of investment, like I said, in institutional structures is something I would really emphasize across all of this.
Thank you very much for that. Sarah, next, and then Dorji. Please, thank you.
Thanks for inviting an intervention. I was mainly here to listen to the country's needs, but I'm happy to contribute. I'm Sarah from the Group on Earth Observation Secretariat based in Geneva. We work also closely with the WMO, and we particularly focus on Earth observations, satellite remote sensing information, and I can probably respond to the question on what other support is needed other than financial support, based on the experience of some of the initiatives in GEO, particularly GeoGLAM, the Geo Global Agriculture Monitoring, which is an international initiative supported by several governments like Germany, the UK, that is active in all countries of the world, and particularly in developing countries that suffer from food crisis. And essentially it helps governments establish their own crop monitoring system based on satellite data that are then agreed with validated data by the country, and trigger particularly early warning and also disaster risk finance when drought and crop failure happens. So we can build on this experience in Uganda and other African countries, for instance, to mainstream this type of information system that is more timely, more accurate for the implementation. And what countries need other than financial support is having a link with these technical teams, having the institutional arrangements in place that encourage this type of collaborations, capacity development, technical and support, co-development, co-design of this type of products since the early phases of the NAP formulation, but mostly on the implementation part. So we are also developing supplemental technical guidance for this type of support, and it's very much aligned with the Green Climate Fund guidance and with the initial NAP guidance, of course, but it's looking more towards the implementation, the technical implementation phase. So happy to work with countries on this.
Thank you very much. And then lastly, I know we're running out of time, but Dorji, the LDCF has been supporting the LDCs and this work for the last 20 years. So you have a wealth of experience and maybe wise words on how we can advance. Over to you, Dorji.
Thank you, Paul, inviting us to make this intervention. Like Sarah, I think I was here actually to listen more to the country perspectives in trying to understand how, as we go forward, to be able to serve our countries better. My name is Dorji. I work with Jeff, and particularly in the area of climate change adaptation team in LDCF and SCCF. Yes, I think in last 20 years of LDCF, we have basically helped 51 LDCs to come up with NAPAs. And we have been addressing the urgent and immediate needs of the countries. And been able to, we have invested some close to $2 billion and have had good results in terms of number of beneficiaries. I think this is coming close to about 55 million people. I think that's in terms of numbers. Putting this statistic aside, I think as we look forward, look ahead, we just have recently adopted the new strategy that's looking for the next 4 years. That's all I can talk about in terms of the time frame of long term, because our strategy gets updated every 4 years. And in this particular next 4 years, starting next month till mid of 2026, we wish to further focus on implementation of adaptation actions based on country needs and priorities. And be it NAPs or anything else in terms of adaptation, I think we are here to offer our support. A couple of things to reflect also in the previous discussions on the information. I think we are set up to support adaptation, so I think adaptation rationale remains at the center of our proposals. And I think in that respect, I think information is key. And we tend to look at gold standards of having a couple of scenarios being projected ahead of us, but we have been flexible in large sense, trying to reflect the ground realities. And I think the second point is also we are increasingly being told, and that's how we have come up with a strategy, that the policy coherence, in our words, which is basically an institutions linking each other properly in various sectors to work together, so that it's not only just to go beyond projects, and we're looking at upscaling and making it to the higher impacts level. With that, thank you very much. I think I see Paul getting restless up there, so maybe it's time for me to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorji. In fact, my colleague Julie from the Secretariat is sending me a lot of messages that please shut up, shut up, shut up. But I know I'll hand over back to Amina to thank everybody, but I wanted to perhaps do two announcements. We have the NAP Expo coming up in August in Gaborone in Botswana from the 22nd to the 26th of August, so we encourage all of you to participate if you can. And the second is the fact that this event was organized through the NAP Technical Working Group that the LEG convenes, and it's composed of a wide range of organizations and experts. So we do encourage those of you that are in the room and would like to participate in these discussions just to let us know, and we'll add you to the mailing list and so forth. So thank you very much, and over back to you, Amina.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, thanks to all of you for attending this meeting or rather this discussion round. I think we heard some very valuable inputs to the questions that we posed, and we will definitely, go back and discuss them again in the NAP Technical Working Group, but then also within the LAC. And thank you so much for coming, and have a good evening. Bye.